Hello, and welcome to the podcast. This is Getting the Driver's Seat. We're telling stories about leadership moments in small to mid-sized professional practices. I'm your host, Sandra Bekhor, Practice Management Coach at Bekhor Management. I'm excited to introduce our guest today, Garry J. Wise, founder and senior lawyer at Wise Law Office. Garry is a Toronto employment and litigation lawyer. He launched Wise Law Blog in 2005 and was among North America's earliest trailblazing law bloggers. Garry was inducted into the Canadian Law Blogs Hall of Fame in 2017. Garry continues to maintain an active presence on social media platforms with daily updates on legal news and information. So Garry is also a very special guest because he also happens to be my spouse. And in addition to the many CLEs he has presented on ethics, social media, security, and virtual management, we have also presented together for the TLA for Law Line with our dear colleague, Mark Halpert. Hi, Mark. and on the CBA podcast, The Every Lawyer. That podcast was a wild ride, starting with Garry telling a very entertaining tale about how we first met, even though I didn't know he was going to do that. So Garry keeps me on my toes, even after 23 years. Welcome, Garry.
Hello, Sandra. Thank you for having me for your inaugural podcast of 2024. And I'm looking forward to seeing the surprises you have in store for me. So I'll leave that to you. But I know what you want to talk about today is looking forward, um, thinking about planning and trying to take advantage of opportunity and get a sense of where you're going. And in the back of our minds, trying to align that with our objectives in terms of why we're doing what we're doing and how we're looking to accomplish what we wanted to accomplish. So that's what I know about our subject matter for today. And the rest of it, I'm in your hands. So thank you. And let's go.
Yes, and I love how you framed that to be related to the beginning of the year. I'm a planner and I love New Year's resolutions. Of course, Garry knows this. And I love to get into planning mode for the preparation of a new year. I do that formally with a friend of mine, which I always post about on LinkedIn. And I also do a vision challenge, which I'm doing for the second time with Valerie Burton. I'll post links in the description for anyone who's interested in exploring this. And so I just want to summarize our theme a little bit differently, just to keep you on your toes, Garry. This is what you said to me a few days ago that I thought was so interesting. You said, when we're talking about the idea of finding your why, it's really an ongoing, continual search for an elusive why. And, when we talk about the why, it's your why in work, it's your why in life. It's really the same why. Well, you're the same person wherever you go. And you also said that it's not about finding your why. It's about always finding your new why, because everything keeps changing, the world around us and we ourselves. So really want to dig into that because nobody's talking about finding your purpose as in always coming up with the new purpose. What's your new purpose today or this year? What does that mean to you, Garry, since I'm actually rephrasing something you said?
Well, I think that what I was referring to then, and happy to talk about it now, is that we live in a world that's just so constantly changing. Whether it's technology, whether it's the people we're working with, whether it's the opportunities that are there in the legal world, what files we're working on at any given time, and what are their requirements and demands. And that's without the curveballs. And when I think about the curveballs, of course, COVID comes to mind as being, such a major interruption to life as we knew it that caused a lot of us to reevaluate everything, including where we work and the role of an office, and very much trying to respond to our associates and employees in terms of what their preferences are within the parameters of what works in a law practice in 2024. So all of us have been engaged in a process of reevaluation and change. It's funny because you talked about your proclivity for planning, and as you know, I'm not really a believer in planning, except I am. When I, the thing about plans is they really do help you to assess your direction. And I love the idea of establishing a list of objectives and goals at the beginning of a year or whatever period of time you're working with, that are sort of big picture. But the operational approach, especially in a small or medium-sized practice, um, needs to maintain flexibility at all times, simply because things change and circumstances require that they change. So while I recognize the importance of keeping the big picture in mind, and I very much am looking to do that at all times, as well as doing wish lists and dream lists of things that we'd like to see happen. I think one of the philosophical changes that's happened for me over time is the recognition that things are going to change. And rather than fight that, develop the skill to be flexible and go along with whatever changes are presenting based on life in the world, and the absence of pandemics and etc. So for me, it's a constant process of saying, where are we? Where do we want to get to? What's the next step to take? Um, but I think when it comes to plotting out 12-step plans, or 15-step plans to get from point A to point B, that's probably not going to play out the way you anticipate. And sticking too rigidly to that kind of a plan is probably going to blind you to really, really new opportunities that are coming your way.
Yes, and now the listeners will see why you and I balance each other. I, I just want to tease apart two concepts that we're talking about here because I think it will really help to separate the idea of planning from purpose. Because purpose actually takes us way deeper into our intention in life, and it's more of a lifelong journey. And planning can be, well, it can be about this year, it can be about this week, it can be about a project. So it really is about extending that purpose into a real world action. But they're very different concepts. They just influence each other. And I know that the planning aspect of it, you're describing it as going a little bit more fluidly, which I recognize you need to do when life changes around you. And but the part that's about your purpose, that's more about being introspective and understanding how you tick. So can you talk a little bit about yourself and how do you tap into that? All of us do it differently, and some of us don't really have a method that we do in a more formal way. But is there anything that you can share about how do you tap into that sense of purpose in yourself?
It's an interesting question, and you asked me to speak personally, and I will. But as you were raising the question, what I was thinking about are all my employment law clients over the years.
Mm.
Um, People come to see employment lawyers, typically in the very beginning when they're about to take on a new job, and they might want some advice about an employment agreement. Um, and then the next time you'll hear from them, hopefully you won't, but the next time you'll hear from them is when there may be some trouble in the workplace and they're not feeling secure about their position, or something has changed that's detrimental. And and occasions, of course, where people are terminated and they need to review a package. But mostly what they're really doing at all of these stages is thinking about their lives and their careers. And in virtually every case of a wrongful dismissal, upon a review of the history of what's happened in the workplace, um, almost inevitably, you can conclude that you could see this one coming. You could see how changes in the workplace, a new manager or a merger or acquisition, a new philosophy in the workplace, new objectives in the workplace, a new compensation plan in the workplace. You can see how all of those kinds of occurrences can uproot what everybody's expectations have been to date. And in spite of all of the planning, including planning that in the employment circumstance probably happened at the employer's initiative, while all of that day-to-day planning was going on operationally, there were some higher level plans being made at a boardroom level that ultimately impact what the company is going to look like. And as you're in a workplace environment that's going through those kinds of changes, you need to pivot. Um, the the best thing somebody can do when they're feeling like their job is about to end is get to work looking for the next job. As an example, something I routinely advise people to do. Don't wait until you're unemployed to look for a new job, but be proactive and recognize that it's much easier to find a new role when you're still employed somewhere. There's a lot less explaining you need to do on job interviews, and there's a higher sense of security, and you don't bring that sense of do or die to every interview. So it's a much better place. And I think that using those experiences on the lawyer side of the table as a learning experience for me has been quite useful. And most lawyers, particularly those in small practices, will experience similar dynamics in their workplace. There's always change. And I think the most important thing you can do with change is plan ahead. And by plan ahead, I don't mean necessarily doing, a PowerPoint with 24 slides of what lies ahead, but take your steps one at a time proactively to begin to explore what options are out there for you. And at the same time, reassess where you're at in terms of whether it does meet your needs. So I think that in terms of outlining what your why is, by why we mean what makes you tick, the reasons you're doing what you're doing, and the motivations you have and your overall aspirations. In order to do all of that, you need to very squarely face where you're at and learn more about what your options are, what changes you can make seamlessly. And oftentimes, losing a job winds up being the kick in the pants that a disgruntled and frustrated employee needed to get moving on into the next phase of your career. So using employment law as sort of the one kind of metaphor for this process that everybody goes through. The same is true in other areas of practice that I've encountered, whether it be family law, whether it be people who are injured, people suddenly encountering a fork in the road that they might not have contemplated. And, what I could suggest after doing this since 1986, which is a long time, is count on the fork in the road. It's going to arise, and you're going to be asked at some point in your life to address one of those situations and to wind your way through it to get to a better place. And I can honestly say just that most of my clients have soft landings and are able to achieve fresh starts in a new way, in a new environment, and they're generally much better off, happier, and more satisfied for it. So what does that mean in terms of me and my history? Feel free to interrupt me anytime you like. When you trace the trajectory of a career that's like pushing 40 years, and all of the phases and all of the changes that have occurred, the disruptions, that just have come our way, from technology to people to expectations, in the workplace, to the internet, to the far more educated client, um, to COVID and getting through that period, and doing major pivots with technology and with the way we operate, um, to being back up and running, in a way that in our firm's case is largely virtual, although we do and will always have an actual brick and mortar office, but most of us do prefer to work and collaborate from home. These are just many, many changes that, if you're a business person or if you're a lawyer starting out in your practice, or a lawyer midway through your practice, you're going to encounter all of these kinds of things, as well as changes, that we can't quite anticipate, including AI and what the role of AI is going to be in the typical law firm of the next 10 or 15 years. And we can brace ourselves for all kinds of changes in the way we operate. We know that the legal profession has a huge problem with access to justice, and people beginning to bypass legal advice altogether simply because of cost and other institutional obstacles. So with that in mind, I think that at the beginning of this year, and perhaps every year, it's important to take stock. Where are we at? Where are people at? Where is the legal profession at? What's happening in the law? What changes can we anticipate? And what's the next curveball that the world is going to throw our way? So feel free to unpack as you put into any of this, or you've encountered similar types of challenges in your career as well, and you're a person who's been very flexible in terms of change, and it's I think to some extent a way of life. Either you pivot, or you die. So as a practical matter, all of us are pivoting on some level.
Well, that's a very generous way of putting it for those of us who don't see ourselves as adaptable. I guess we are pivoting, even if we don't label ourselves that way. So I just want to pick up on a few things that you made there, Garry, in that very eloquent, speech about our theme. I felt your heart. I didn't expect you, when I asked you that question about purpose, I didn't expect you to talk about your clients and your connection to their journey. I just didn't expect that. And when you were talking about it, I really felt your heart. I felt your empathy for them and their experiences. And I was just wondering how that relates to your feeling about your own purpose as you guide them, as you hold their hand through that experience, the from the beginning to the end, the difficult and then the the hopeful.
Um, well, it's a great question. I think most of my colleagues in the legal profession will tell you that one of the really special aspects of doing this job is the ability to talk to people in a confidential way about where they're really at. Um, things that may be difficult to talk about with friends and family, sometimes they're easier to talk about with an arm's length professional. And as a result, I think that we have the opportunity to see through a bit of a different window, um, because we do hear from clients about their concerns, their shock when things don't go well, their apprehensions and fears. And I think that while those are all really, really difficult emotions to experience, especially in the moment, um, there's something to be said for developing familiarity with that space, with that emotional space that people are in, and developing a vocabulary um, to assist people to get through it on a personal level, which also helps them to get through it from a legal standpoint. So, the, there are two people involved in the solicitor client interaction, at least two people, typically, the lawyer and the client. And I think both are going to be informed by each other to some extent. And every case is a little bit different. Every personality is impacted a little bit differently by events that occur, from those who take it very seriously and to heart, and are deeply upset by change, to those who do take it in stride, and feel in the employment law circumstance that maybe the world is doing them a bit of a favor by forcing them to change. So, we began that part of the discussion with thoughts about your why changing, and how circumstances are going to be a big part of when and how and why your own why will change. And again, we don't always have control over all those elements. We can control many of them. And I think it's a real good idea to try to. But let's be honest about the fact that there is vulnerability um, in in professional life, in the human existence, and we're always refreshing. We're always trying to get ourselves aligned with what's going to work and what feels right and what makes sense to us as practitioners and professionals in terms of our own aspirations.
Yeah, and I think what I'm hearing from you is part of your own purpose, sense of purpose that maybe carries through the decades, even while your plans change, is you're a guide of some sort to your clients as they're experiencing some of their most vulnerable moments of their life. And you're doing that with recognition that it is a privilege to be by their side because they're trusting you with their secrets, with the things that are hardest for them to talk about, even with their loved ones. And approaching it in that way is very different from saying, I'm an employment lawyer, which is really just tactical.
Well, I'd like to think most of my colleagues um, on the employee side of the employment law bar share that approach and philosophy. Um, and the reality is that we if you've been doing it long enough, you know that most of these matters resolve with a soft landing at some point down the road. And in the typical case, within 6 months or a year, um, people are going to be on to their next thing. And in most cases, their case will have been resolved and they'll be moving on to their next career. Like, just having seen it so many times, I think it's good to be able to reassure people, um, that this too gets better. Even though the initial moments are difficult to handle and very unsettling, and fill people with apprehension about their financial security, and um, about their careers, and there are all kinds of questions that people typically have when their employment is terminated about their own abilities and competence and why it wasn't a fit. And um, having sort of the the ability to say to people, um, I've seen this before. I know it seems awful right now, but we're going to get through this, and you're going to get a satisfactory outcome, and you're going to be able to move on. I think that that's a it's a very realistic way to speak with people who are in those circumstances, because most of the time it's right. And I think that at least giving people some optimism about that, as well as suggesting that where they have, in some cases, that they may have um, skill sets that can be updated and refreshed with training or whatever it is, to truly look at what their aspirations are and what they need to do in order to get there, and what the job market out there is telling them, and what they're hearing on interviews, or if they're ever having trouble getting interviews, um, how to approach it. So I mean, it's all holistic to the extent that people are in the midst of change, and we, as their legal professionals, um, we're among the group of people who they speak with to get some guidance about their legal entitlements, but also just hopefully some horse sense about how to move forward one step at a time.
Hmm. Yeah, those are the practical things that come from experience because you've seen it so many times. But I want to pick up on something that you said earlier, which was the intersection of your personal sense of purpose and the firm's purpose, right? Because we don't, when we talk about purpose, I think most people think about it as a personal thing. You have your life purpose, and what motivates you, what gets you going, through the day. But a company also has a purpose, and sometimes that purpose, as you rightly put it, changes. And really, then you have this disconnect between the people who used to feel like they fit and now they no longer fit. And it could be that the firm is experiencing changes in the business environment, and that's the reason that its purpose changed, because it had to go through some kind of an evolution. And then as a result, the people who used to be a fit may no longer be a fit. Or as the firm owner, you have to go out searching for people who are fit, or you reignite the motivation in the people that are working there because you see a way of them reconnecting. So I just would like to talk about how, as a firm owner, you have not just the responsibility to connect your own sense of purpose, to articulate a sense of purpose for your firm, but also to mentor people who work for you to connect to their own sense of purpose and to see that alignment with the firm. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Well, sure. I think certain questions are going to arise that are very much defined by where you are in your practice. If you're starting out as an articling student, or in some cases a first year lawyer, your questions are going to start with, where is it that I'm supposed to stand when I'm in court? It's going to be very basic stuff that when you know that, you're able to move on to the next milestones, but it's going to be very difficult until you've mastered those early developmental steps. And in the early portion of your career, um, what you're really doing is taking little mini steps that are allowing you to evaluate how you're doing. And I think while most people at the beginning of their careers um, will have very individual reasons um, why they're lawyers and why they've entered the legal profession, I think all of them are going to have some very common um, questions and objectives just about developing core competencies. And the reason I mention this in particular is that in terms of the why of a firm, so the things that motivate a firm and move a firm forward, especially a small firm, um, being mindful of where your colleagues are in their developmental stages and making space to accommodate those is a big part of having a firm. And if by a firm you mean a collection of people who, in a general sense, are working together and expect and hope to work together for the foreseeable future, the longer short-term future, then obviously your planning needs to allow for where everybody is at their stage of the career. And if you're sort of mid-career and you're in that 10-year bracket, um, things will have changed. Um, you'll have all those core competencies. You're probably going to have a track record of success and some sense of what you're able to do, and some sort of feeling about um, the high watermarks of your career so far, the best outcomes, the best results, the happiest clients, the work you're proudest of, and that body of work is going to inform not only how you feel about yourself, and I think that most lawyers will have a much higher level of confidence about what they're doing in year 10 than they did at the 6 month mark. But having said that, that level of confidence then informs your own planning and your own aspirations and ambitions and your own why at that stage. Um, it may well be that after 10 years, you have a family. You have financial obligations that you didn't have in the beginning of your career. And that's going to be a big part of what motivates you and your why. And, so a firm is a collection of people who are all in different periods of their professional journeys. And, drawing on what you said earlier, ideally, a firm provides a foundation, a place where people can do all of that growth and reaching toward their own um, objectives, can do it collectively with mutual support. So in some ways, that's easier to do in a virtual environment than in the old brick and mortar environment, simply because in a virtual environment, you have to be a bit intentional about getting together and talking about things that are on the table, and one-on-one meetings with your with your people to assess where they're at and to hear what their concerns are. And I can say, and you and I have spoken about this before, but it seems like one of the greatest challenges we have right now is the desire people have for human contact in the context of work and that personal touch. And everybody talks about missing the good old days when you could just walk next door into somebody's office and have a 10-minute chat about a case, or a business concern, and come up with a quick answer. And that's not as possible now. And the water cooler is really not something that exists in any virtual practice. But on the other hand, it's probably easier to get together on Zoom for 5 minutes in a planned way, or 20 minutes, than it is to barge in on somebody who's in the middle of something else, to bend their ear at the possible risk of interrupting what their flow is. So there was always push and pull around that. But what we're hearing from our people is that the human touch is the one thing that they're feeling a need for. And I guess that's not surprising. You know, it's an era where the technology has dictated the way people communicate in such a way um, that we know something is a bit off. Um, and I think our job as practice managers is to figure out a way to give people that human connection within their firms with their colleagues that makes them feel like they're part of a group of a team as opposed to somebody sitting at a remote computer having remote conversations about remote cases. You know, so I think those are some of the challenges, and to the extent that AI is probably going to become a bigger part of our practices over the next 5 or 10 years. Again, I wonder whether that's going to contribute to even more distance between people, um, or whether somehow we're going to pull all this together and come up with a formula that works, that gives people the opportunity to take advantage of all of the advantages of virtual working, while also maintaining that team atmosphere, um, and you know interactive working and collegiality and collaboration. But if that's going to happen, I think that the firm has to be intentional about making that happen, because I don't think it's necessarily going to happen organically.
Well, I'm glad you brought up this idea of human connection and how it's being disrupted in this virtual, landscape that we're in right now. Because I actually wanted to ask you about obstacles, the obstacles to a sense of purpose. Disengagement is a very big problem these days in the workplace, in professional practice. You're all dependent on people. You're not running a company that has machinery and widgets. It's all about the people. And if your people are experiencing disengagement, it's a real problem. So why do we spend so much time talking about finding our sense of why? It's because that's the source of our motivation. It's our fuel. And mentors who know how to tap into the motivation of the people who work for them, with them, they're the most successful mentors. So you just answered a question before I asked it, which was really about what can be some of those obstacles to helping your team find their own why. And I'm just wondering, are there any other obstacles? When you start to see somebody's spark die down and they're just sort of dragging themselves through their work, you can see it. They used to be they used to be passionate and excited and high energy, and then you just see that light diminish. um, this happens in coaching, and I know it happens, in practice management. So I'm just wondering if there are any other obstacles that you uh, can talk about, but also how do you overcome the obstacle?
Well, I think where we started today is there are always obstacles. And, we can say in a pat way, learn to take it in stride. And okay, if you're the kind of person who takes things in stride, then you probably don't need this conversation. Um, and maybe you can find one of those and interview them, and they'll tell us all their secrets. With the legal profession has become incredibly and increasingly complex since I was called to the bar. We live in an extremely different world. I can blame technology for it, um, and that's probably only
Mhm.
partly fair. But the truth is, you've heard me say this before, but when I started, um, if an issue came up on a file, I would dictate a letter on it, and then put the file away for a week, because it would take a week for the letter to be transcribed and sent out, whether it was by ordinary mail or by fax, which was just beginning. When I was starting, um, but literally, you would work on the file, you would do whatever step it was, and you would be done with that file. And now, with email and rapid fire correspondence, it's literally not unusual to have a response to an email within seconds. And if it's not within seconds, a week or 2 weeks of delay between letter and response is certainly not going to be more than a day in most cases, a day or 2 days in most cases. And one of the outcomes of that, the technology, is it's so much easier to communicate. And because it's so much easier to communicate, people do communicate. And we have, cases where there are 10,000 emails in a year going back and forth between us and our client and opposing counsel and the courts. And that's a lot of paper, even though it's not paper. That's a lot of volume. And this is just one example of the complexity. As well, the access to legal research online um, has given us amazing opportunity to find out everything we ever wanted to know about every topic. And because it's so easy, we now probably have a professional obligation to do a lot of that research that just simply would not have been cost effective in the old days, but it adds to your plate. So I would simply say that the body of law in the areas that I practice in has grown immeasurably over the years that I've been practicing. I'm sure that the generations before me can say exactly the same thing, but law is becoming a much more demanding job, certainly in the litigation world, I believe it is. And that's happening at a time when there's a bit of pushback um, from all of us about work-life balance. And what do you do with a professional role that's a monster that keeps growing and growing and growing and growing, while also protecting enough of your personal space to not get overwhelmed by it? And most people do at some point get a bit overwhelmed and have to take a step back. And again, here we are at the beginning of the year, and people talk about um, these issues when they're thinking about what their objectives are and why they're doing it. And again, a firm that's going to be successful is going to recognize that this is a reality. It's an ever more demanding job at a time when people need to have boundaries and firms need to have boundaries. And this is, I think, the zeitgeist of what's happening now in the current um, the current law office, or many current law offices, is trying to figure out what the formula is to move into this next era. And we all do some thinking like that after a holiday break where we've had some time to think. Hopefully, not too much about work, but we spend time thinking about work even when we're on our downtime. And as we move forward into a new year, every individual is going to have their own aspirations, the objectives that they want to meet. Many employers are going to have their own list of objectives that they think it would be helpful and important for each of the people in the firm to aspire toward. So there's this refresh and rethink and reset that happens. And again, that's just in the natural order of things. That's without contemplating that there was a pandemic not so long ago that seemed to change everything. And our culture is still adjusting to that. And, as a major cog in our culture, the professional office is still pivoting and adjusting as well.
Mhm. And I know that your firm does retreats, which is one way of reconnecting on these loftier ideas, but also inviting every individual to bring some of their own changes and their reflections about these things to that group discussion so that you don't have them feeling isolated and lost off on their own tangent.
Yeah, I guess that over time, I've come to see these kinds of conversations as being less lofty than pragmatic. Um, I don't think I don't think it's a lofty philosophical experience to recognize that people always have tension points that affect their careers, and to as one of the fundamental objectives of a successful practice to try and make sure within your means and ability that there's support available for that. And and everybody arrives with their own baggage because they've all had other experiences, some good, some scary in other workplaces. And especially in a small firm, um, I think the more aware you are of what's really motivating people, the more aware they are, the better.
This was an amazing conversation. I would like to ask you a more personal question. When
Okay.
we, you did say I was going to have a surprise for you, so here you go.
Okay. Now I'm
Um,
getting scared. Well, it's only fair because I did it to you last time around. So is this your revenge?
aha, I have to know. So when we originally talked about this idea of a sense of purpose, your answer to me was, well, that's what I do with my music. And is there anything, I really think it's an interesting idea just because there are some people who are listening to this that have their own creative outlets and probably also approach it that way. And I'm into art, visual arts for similar reasons. But there may also be people listening to this who have never picked up a guitar, who have never tried to paint something, but actually may be interested. And, I think it's helpful for them to hear about that experience. How does this connect you to your sense of purpose, articulating it, expressing it, feeling it? Is there anything you want to say about that?
Nope. Yeah, sure. Again, for those who have the creative place that they go to, and the creative place doesn't have to be about art or music. It can be about golf. It can be
Or
about
cooking?
or working out in the gym. It can be about cooking. And Paul Adam of our firms did a great video for TikTok, um, where he was combining a recipe with talking about estate planning. And that's an example of somebody who has a passion for something totally unrelated to their practice, but brings it in as a part of a way of introducing himself to the world and showcasing um, aspects of his personality. I think that's great. Whatever your thing is, um, it, it's a really good thing to build in that area too, as part of your own peace of mind, work-life balance. And I think that in terms of the legal side of things, sometimes that more creative space um, is actually the space you need to be in to solve your most difficult legal challenges, your case challenges. It's sometimes taking a step back from the usual um, logical, step by step approach to lawyering. Sometimes just taking a step back and being in a different mindset and actually thinking about human aspects of the case that you might not necessarily get to in your legal drafting and your pleadings, but the things that are actually driving the case that might be important to figuring out solutions. Well, sometimes that creative space is where it's going to come to you and where you're going to have that aha moment.
Mhm.
So I think it's really important, for me, and I've talked about this before, that music and writing um, borrows a lot from the same skill set as practicing law. It's about storytelling. It's about capturing the essence of the characters that you're writing about, whether they be, um, in a song, or whether it be about the individuals who are our clients. Um, I think that it's good to, at least part of the time, have your eye on those aspects of your professional dealings, the people, the players, the solutions, and so I guess I haven't totally achieved work-life balance. If I'm telling you that one of the benefits of that creative stuff is you might have an aha moment about the office in the middle of doing an electric guitar part, but it's true. It does happen that way sometimes.
Sure, because being in that creative space lights up a different part of your brain. You're not in
Yeah.
analytical mode. You're in a creative, open space that's more about connecting. So, Gary, that is a really wonderful note for us to close on, pun intended. And I just wanted to ask you, is there anything that you want to add before we say goodbye
Well, really, just congratulations to you.
to me?
Your podcast has been up and running for a while. You developed a really impressive body of work, and you know, glad to see it. I think it's really neat, and I think you're talking to practitioners and professionals about things that are really making them tick, that people don't usually talk about, and I think that we're in a period where it's good for people um, to be open about um, these aspects of their professional journeys, um, particularly for um, newer professionals who are watching and just recognizing that well, the questions and the considering, and the planning and the pivoting, it's always going to be there. Um, at every stage of your professional career, you're going to encounter um, sort of existential questions about where you're at and where you want to get to. And that's okay. That's normal. So, to the extent that your work, Sandra, is helping showcase people who in real time can explain a bit about what that feels like at their stage of their careers, I think it's great. I think it's a fantastic resource for people to be able to look at and get their own guidance from it.
Thank you for saying that. We're talking today about a sense of purpose, and I really feel that this podcast aligns with my sense of purpose. So I really appreciate what you just said, Gary. This podcast is about interviewing people to share in a very open-hearted way things that help exactly what you just said, Gary, newer practitioners, people who are stepping up to leadership in a new way and who can learn from others who have done it before and who are generously sharing their stories. So that taps into my sense of purpose. And so I just want to say thank you for doing this, Gary. Thank you for your time and your insights. And to our listeners, if you are interested in learning more about Gary Wise, please go to wiselaw.net. You've been listening to Get in the Driver's Seat, stories about leadership moments in small to mid-sized professional practices. I'm your host, Sandra Bekhor, Practice Management Coach at Bekhor Management. Take care, everybody.